In part one of this two-part lecture, we'll be introducing the various types of food molecules, carbohydrates, fat, and protein. We'll talk about what each of these are made of in terms of the smaller monomers that come together to make them, and then focus on some specific roles in the body for these different types of molecules. Just a reminder from a previous lecture, we talked about how the food that we take in can be broken down by catabolism or catabolic pathways. That produces energy that can be used then in the form of ATP, and also energy lost as heat into the surrounding environment, and the actual building blocks. Those building blocks then can be used by the cells in our body to produce new, larger molecules or polymers through anabolism, the combining of those back together. That's also shown over here in just a different schematic of the same thing. Breaking down food into energy small blocks, energy being used then to recombine those to make our own molecules, proteins, fat, etc. So we'll talk about each of these, about how, for example, protein is composed of smaller building blocks or monomers called amino acids. Carbohydrates are our main source of energy in addition to fats, and fat consists of molecules mainly called triglycerides. We'll talk about how those are broken down and used by the body as well. So, to start out, carbohydrates. You can see here we've got pictures of bread, cereal, wheat, pasta, rice, popcorn, beans. These are all, maybe not beans, sorry, macaroni, noodles. These are all high in carbohydrates. We can categorize carbohydrates based upon how they're used by our body. Either they are able to be broken down and digested, in which case we can access the energy stored in them, so they're provided energy source, or they're indigestible. They cannot be broken down, and if you can't break them down, you can't get the energy that's present inside of those carbohydrates. So as mentioned, this is one of our most common sources of energy. We often just use the word carbs for short instead of saying carbohydrates. It's very important to note that carbohydrates includes sugars. So sugars are carbohydrates, as are these larger molecules we'll talk about, like starch, cellulose, and more. The simplest carbohydrates we call simple sugars, or mono, remember that means one, saccharides. It's like sweet things. So one sweet thing. These are monomers, carbohydrate monomers. Oops. C-A-R-B-O. So carbohydrate monomers, we call those monosaccharides. And as you can see from the picture down here, two or more of these monosaccharides can be combined together to make what we call complex carbohydrates, or carbohydrate polymers. We'll talk about some examples of each of these. Before we do, though, here are two examples of simple sugars of monosaccharides I'd like you to know. We don't need to worry about this term isomers here. That's beyond the depth of this class. If you go into chemistry, you'll learn about that. But glucose, that's our blood sugar. And fructose, the sugar found in fruit and also in honey. That's where that word fruit comes from. And those are both monosaccharides. They provide a very quick source of energy to the body. The simplest complex carbohydrate has only two monosaccharides combined together. So it's called a disaccharide. One example of this is sucrose. That's the regular sugar that you would bake with or maybe sprinkle in your coffee if you have sugar in coffee. Maltose, sugar found in beer and in malt products. Beyond that, like if you ever have a shake from, I don't know, Chick-fil-A, you put malt powder in there. That makes a malt. That's maltose sugar. Lactose, the sugar that's present in dairy products. These are some examples of disaccharides. A little tip that'll make it really easy to identify sugars is that most sugars are going to end in this OSE. It typically tells you it's a sugar. Lactose, maltose, sucrose. And then from the monosaccharides, fructose, glucose. You see the pattern emerging here? So a polysaccharide is made now by having many, many monosaccharides linked together. In plants, the two main polysaccharides are starch. We've introduced this in lab. Starch is used to store energy. And cellulose is not really used to store energy. Instead, it is a structural, STRU, a structural carbohydrate. So they're both made of the exact same thing, glucose. But the difference is how those glucose molecules are organized. Here in starch, it's much more easily digestible, easily broken apart. Than in cellulose, it makes these really long, rigid, inflexible chains that are very hard for most organisms to digest. And so that gives them their different properties. Starch storing energy, and cellulose for making the cell very strong and sturdy, giving some structure to it. As I mentioned before, your blood sugar, when somebody says they have low blood sugar, they're talking about glucose being low. And most of the carbohydrates we take in, those that are digestible, get converted into glucose. If we are being active and using that up right away, it just goes through a process to make usable energy. What process would that be? That's right, cellular respiration, right, to make ATP. However, if it's not all being used, or taking in more than we need, first it's going to be stored in our bodies as glycogen. Glycogen is stored primarily in our livers, but also to a lesser degree in our muscle. And once that gets filled up, then for long-term storage, our body starts making fat. If you consume either simple sugars or disaccharides, anything but polysaccharides, you get a relatively rapid increase in your blood sugar levels as digestion happens. And then, assuming your body is regulating it properly and you don't have diabetes, it goes back down to normal relatively quickly. However, if instead you have something that has more complex carbohydrates in it, it takes longer for the body to break that apart. So you get a much more gradual kind of time release of sugar. And then it remains that way for a little bit longer, a little bit steadier. So it provides you with a more lasting source of energy than this quick, brief input due to simple sugars. As I mentioned before, cellulose is this structural carbohydrate, and as humans, we are not able to digest cellulose. There are actually very few animals that can digest cellulose. So when you hear this word fiber, which I'm sure you've heard of before, cellulose is the main source of fiber in our diet. We cannot digest it, so we cannot get any energy from it. Even though we can't get energy from it, it still is a very important nutrient for us for a number of reasons. Can you think of any benefits of having enough fiber in your diet? Fiber is sometimes called roughage. I'll talk about why it's sometimes called roughage. Well, if you're stumped as to benefits of fiber, think about some commercials or advertisements you may have seen. Like, for example, on a box of Cheerios. You might see heart healthy, or on oatmeal. And in addition to that, you may hear about it helping to keep you from getting constipated. So regularity means that, You keep pooping, right? You don't get constipated. If you are getting constipated, try increasing the fiber in your diet and drinking more water. Both of those are main things to keep you regular. It's been shown to reduce the chance of developing colon cancer. Kind of believes that it sort of scrapes out the insides of your intestines and keeps it clean so that there's not a lot of stuff building up that could lead to cancer. It can lower the cholesterol in your blood. We'll talk about different types of cholesterol later on, good versus bad. And it also slows the rate at which sugar absorbs into the bloodstream. So you have less of those spikes. So if you're a diabetic and you're craving something sweet, try to have some fiber or more complex carbohydrates with that simple sugar to try to reduce the rate of that sugar going into the bloodstream. You can get fiber through a number of natural sources, which we'll talk about on the next page, but sometimes when you get older especially, you just don't want to eat as much. And so instead, you will get a fiber supplement that also offers you many of those same benefits. You'll notice here in this sampling of foods that are high in fiber that not a single one of them is an animal product. And that's because, remember, a few slides ago, we said that plants make starch and plants make cellulose. Animals do not make either of those complex carbohydrates. Therefore, cellulose being the main source of fiber in our diet is coming from plant products. An easy way to remember most foods that are high in fiber is the ones that are chewy, or the parts of the foods that are chewy and tough. For example, if you have beans, it's not the inside of the bean that has fiber. It does have a little bit maybe, but most of the fiber is in the actual kind of the husk, outside part of the bean. Same thing with fruits. If you peel an apple, you're losing most of the fiber present in the outer skin of the apple. Same thing with a baked potato. The skin of the potato has most of the fiber. So think about tough, chewy, crunchy things. Those are usually high in fiber. There are a few exceptions. You can see over here that an avocado, which is obviously very smooth and creamy, also is high in fiber. Raspberries, got seeds and stuff that make them high in fiber. And some of these, when we cook them, they get soft, but they're hard otherwise. Here's a quick question. I'll ask you to pause now and think about what the answer might be based on what we just went through. Okay, so hopefully you've paused the video and had time to come up with an answer here. Which source of carbohydrates will be digested the quickest? Let's see which ones we can rule out. We should be able to cross off whole wheat bread. That's got a lot of complex carbohydrates in it. It's also got a lot of fiber in there, so that's going to take a long time to digest. Now, applesauce, yes, it has some simple sugars in there, but it's also got some starch and some more complex carbs, so we can cross that off. Now we're down to milk and honey. Well, the carbohydrate in milk is lactose. In honey, it is fructose. And remember I said we want to know what those were? This was a disaccharide. Let's put di. Whereas fructose is a monosaccharide. So fructose does not need to be broken down at all to be then used in cellular respiration. So therefore, honey is going to provide a very, very quick source of energy with minimal processing needed, just cellular respiration. Because animals don't make starch nor cellulose, they make two similar, or related I should say, polysaccharides, glycogen and chitin. A lot of students mispronounce this word here as chitin. That is not the way you pronounce it. It's pronounced chitin, like flying a kite. Kite in. Glycogen is the animal version of starch. It's used for storing energy. Just like starch and cellulose, both glycogen and chitin are made up of glucose. just different 3D structures when they're all put together. Chitin is like cellulose, but for animals, in that it is a structural thing. It's not used for energy. Chitin makes up the shells of various insects and lobsters and crabs, etc. It makes them very, very, very tough. So think about all we've learned about these various carbohydrates and take a minute to read through this, pause the video, and decide which answer is best. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance now to choose your answer. If not, pause here and try to figure it out. All of the above. Starch, glycogen, chitin, and cellulose are all made of the same thing, glucose, but they have different three-dimensional structures. So, check. The same molecule, glucose, is put together to make them? Yes. Starch and cellulose are made by plants. Glycogen and chitin are made by animals? Yes. Starch and glycogen are used to store energy. Cellulose and chitin are for structure. So this is a good summary question here. This is something you'll want to make sure you're very comfortable with, because you'll find a number, at least a few questions on the test related to this, these concepts. Now we're moving on to proteins. I want to point out before I go on to the next slide, though, that although this picture is only showing animal products, there are plenty of plant products that are also very high in protein. Seeds, nuts, legumes, certain other vegetables. So not just animal products. Proteins are one of the most diverse types of molecules in the body. We'll find at least 10,000 different kinds of proteins in our body, playing different roles like transporting oxygen around the body in the case of hemoglobin, which we'll talk about in a future topic. Antibodies, immune system proteins that help to protect you from infection. Keratin, which is the protein we learned about in lab as part of your skin. Why does it keep doing this? Various enzymes that help reactions to occur. Lactase, we'll talk about in the next few slides here, helps to break down the sugar lactose. And also proteins involved in helping to generate movement. Actin is one of those proteins. So proteins are polymers. The individual building blocks that are put together to make protein are called amino acids. There are 20 different kinds of amino acids in the body, kind of like a 20-letter alphabet. And the order that you put them in is going to create these different words, these different proteins. Each protein's structure is determined by that order of amino acids, which then leads to greater folding and stuff to create this final protein shape. And the function of these proteins is based upon that structure. So if that amino acid sequence is changed, or something causes that protein structure to change, the function can be completely disrupted in certain cases. Take sickle cell disease, for example. We'll talk more about sickle cell disease later on in the course. But sickle cell disease is due to just a single change in the amino acid of that protein, like a single letter change in the alphabet. And because of that, you go from having this normal hemoglobin, the protein that transports oxygen, to having this abnormal hemoglobin. And instead of having these normal kind of raft-shaped red blood cells, you've got these sickled ones that are kind of C-shaped and long and jagged, and they get stuck places. It causes lots of problems. When you hear enzymes, you should think proteins, because enzymes are proteins. And all enzymes play the same basic role to help start and to speed up chemical reactions. So all enzymes do this, help start and speed up chemical reactions. because most chemical reactions would happen by themselves automatically. However, enzymes help it happen at a rate that's useful for us. During this process, the enzymes don't get used up. They can be used over and over and over again as long as enough energy is there and the products are available. Think of enzymes as like a cashier at a grocery store. People keep coming through the checkout and they get their stuff rung up and put it in a bag and then off to go. Enzymes, the cashier, the groceries are the stuff going into the enzyme, the products, and the bagged groceries are the substrates coming out. We're not going to worry about these details here about the enzymes process, but this is something you'll probably want to know for a future class, like either microbiology or anatomy and physiology if you're going on to those classes. For this question, I don't necessarily expect you to know the answer at this point, but I'd like you to take a minute, pause the video, and try to guess at least what answer you think is correct. Okay, so the question was, what causes lactose intolerance? So, lactose intolerance is due to an inability to digest the sugar lactose in dairy products. Let's talk a little bit about lactose intolerance. So here, what we're seeing on the left, this is not lactose intolerance, this is lactose tolerance. This is an individual who has this enzyme lactase. Remember how we said OSE means sugar? Well, ASE typically means enzyme. So enzyme lactase breaks down the sugar lactose. And this happens in your small intestine. It breaks it down into these two monosaccharides. Well, if you don't have lactase or you don't produce enough of it, then we call that lactose intolerance. Because of that, the lactose does not get broken down in your small intestine, and it travels further down your digestive system into your large intestine, where it encounters these bacteria. And these bacteria digest and eat and use up that lactose. However, this generates gas and acids that causes the symptoms associated with lactose intolerance. Flatulence, right? Farting, abdominal pain, general maybe diarrhea, for example. So everyone when they're born, with maybe a few exceptions, is lactose tolerant. Everyone has the enzymes to digest lactose because that's the main source of food, breast milk, for example, and has lactose in it that a baby would need to digest. But at some point, most individuals actually stop producing lactase as they age, leading to lactose intolerance. And so the vast majority of the world is lactose intolerant. There have only been a few places here, these areas where we have the really kind of the dark colors, where mutations have developed that allow individuals to produce lactase, the enzyme, even through adulthood. And this was associated with areas where cows or goats or sheep were raised, and people had access to this new food source. Having this mutation then gave them an advantage because they'd have more nutrients available throughout later on in life. And that spread through the population as those individuals reproduced and survived better. And so we have a lot of individuals in certain parts of the world with the ability to process lactose later in life. But since the majority of the world's population is over here in China and parts of India, we actually have the minority of the world that is lactose tolerant in adulthood. And that finishes up this topic.